If someone describes your novel as cookie cutter, you might be inclined to take that as a bad thing. Which, if you think about it, is kind of an odd conclusion. Cookies are delightful, especially when they're in the shape of a star, or a heart, or a smiley face, which I realize now is really just a circle. Should you be striving to make a unique, non-cookie cutter novel? Is being too similar to the herd hurting your novel? Are generic novels necessarily bad? I get comments occasionally on these videos lamenting the fact that some of my advice will lead to a generic novel, and by extension that going against this advice will yield something better. There's this idea that exists among some people that generic or cookie cutter novels, novels that conform to the broad norms of the literary world, are somehow inferior to those that don't. That uniqueness is somehow correlated with quality. The issue is quite a bit more nuanced than that and bears some more thorough consideration, which is what we're going to do today. Oh, and I only made enough cookies for subscribers, so if you want a cookie, you're gonna have to subscribe. Let's start by defining what we mean by a generic or cookie cutter novel, as there are some complexities to both of those terms. Calling something generic means that it is characteristic of or relates in some way to a larger group of objects. Cookie cutter is a term used as a euphemism for something generic because the purpose of a cookie cutter is to make a bunch of objects, specifically cookies, that are all identical. Something can only be called generic in relation to some other class or group of objects, because in order to be generic, the object in question must share some characteristics with the other objects with which it is compared. Something can't be a population of one and be generic. There is inherently a comparison to some other versions of that object. Calling a novel generic inherently implies a comparison with other novels, meaning that there are many novels that are similar to it, that the generic novel in question is similar to other novels. Using the term generic to describe a novel is not something that can be done in isolation. To level that sort of criticism, you have to be comparing it to something else. And this brings up an interesting point. When people criticize a novel as generic, the negativity associated with that is brought about by their experience with the other novels that they are comparing it to. There is an implied sense of fatigue, an implied sense of experience with whatever characterizes the novel as generic. Categorizing something as generic can only happen if you yourself have experienced a lot of other things that are able to make the thing you're calling generic generic. If you've only eaten cookies for the last 3 days, then eating another cookie won't be a pleasant experience because you're tired of eating cookies. That's all you've been eating. A cookie in this context is generic, and generic is bad because you are tired of eating cookies. A generic novel is only bad if the reader has had prior experience with similar novels and has had so much experience with those prior novels that another novel that's similar to those prior novels is a negative experience. If you read 100 mysteries that are all similar, the first one you read is not going to seem generic and it might be enjoyable. But by the 100th one you read, it might start seeming generic, and the fact that it's generic is problematic because you're getting tired. You're developing this fatigue for novels that are all the same. Even if the 100th novel is a better novel based on other factors, the fatigue, the tiredness, the sameness that's been created by the first 99 novels is going to make that 100th one not seem as good. Generic novels can only be generic based on the experience of the reader. There is an implication of history and comparison whenever something is considered generic. What is generic for one reader could be completely novel and unexpected for another reader. It entirely depends on the experience of that individual reader and what their reading diet has consisted of. And this brings us to the next logical thing to discuss. What aspect of the novel are we considering generic? Is it the plot? Is it the setting? Is it something with the characters? We can look at this through the lens of tropes being used, plot structures being reused, or even down to something like prose structure. There are romance arcs happening across every single genre and setting that you can imagine, and if you really think about it, a lot of those arcs can be called generic because a lot of them share similarities with all of the other romantic arcs that are happening across novels. So if a novel has a unique setting and the writer has a unique writing style, but they've got a standard canned love triangle or other romantic arc in it, is that novel generic or is it not generic? How much needs to be novel in a novel in order for that novel to be novel and not generic? I would also argue that it's possible for uniqueness to become generic. Take someone like Stephen King. Part of his appeal is the creation of arguably unique premises. That's kind of his brand. These unique situations, stuff you don't see other people coming up with. But when going against the norm is your brand, then uniqueness also becomes generic by definition. You could argue that every single one of those novels is generic because it's like all the other novels that are also unique. Which again kind of comes back to this idea of which axis are you defining genericness on. If every single novel you read is completely original and unlike anything you've seen before, does it seem generic because every single time you're getting the same thing? All right, we've reached the part of the script where I got frustrated and realized that this entire concept of unique versus generic novels is just kind of silly and should not actually probably get any serious attention. Most of what I found when I researched this topic was discussions on the internet about someone asking whether or not they should pursue such and such an idea because they felt it was too generic. The problem with these discussions is that they move us away from what most writers should be focusing on. Your focus as a writer should probably mostly be on the quality of your execution, not the originality of your idea. You should not be trying to write an original or a generic novel at all. You should be trying to write a good novel. There are no shortage of ideas out there, and a lot of them probably could be considered unique. That's not the difficult part. We have a surplus of ideas out there. What we have a shortage of is well-executed ideas. This discussion around genericness and uniqueness always happens at such a superficial level that it ignores all of the deeper nuances present in the execution of a novel. How you write your viewpoints, what aspects of the setting you emphasize, how you arrange your plot beats, how you evoke emotion in the reader. These are the things that you should be focused on. Doing these things in a unique way is a lot easier than doing them in a well-executed way. And a well-executed way does not necessarily have to be unique. And this doesn't even get into what I think is the biggest issue with this whole discussion, and that's the question of, can you truly be original? There are millions of stories out there, written in thousands of languages from hundreds of cultures spread across a few dozen millennia. Crafting something truly original, something that no one else has done before, is probably impossible at this point, and the discussion around this idea might just be pointless. A non-generic novel only has merit if it is also written well. That's another point that people don't really consider. And part of writing well means using structures and identifying structures that have worked in the past, because there's a good chance that those structures will continue to work in the future. There's an undertone to some of the discussions around writing a unique novel, this kind of rebellious, I'm not gonna do what people tell me to do kind of spirit to it, which I normally applaud, but at the same time, the reason that something stands the test of time, the reason that a lot of novels do a similar thing, is probably because that thing works. And it's not just suddenly going to stop working because a few hundred novels have used it. At the heart of this, I think, is a misunderstanding around what we assume makes a certain novel work. Human beings have a natural desire to repeat past pleasurable experiences. This is the basis of habits. This is the basis of addiction. This is the basis of compulsion. Our best guide to finding pleasurable things are the things that have given us pleasure in the past. When you frame it this way, it could be argued that a unique novel doesn't trigger a new response in a reader, but rather a repeat of a past response which was positive, which when you think about it can also be caused by a generic novel. When you read something that's the same and you're chasing that past experience again, it's kind of the same thing as when you read something unique. You are still chasing that past experience, but instead of going after the same thing, you're trying to go after something new. I don't know if any of that makes any sense, so let me know down below. I kind of went in a bunch of circles when I was writing the script. Ultimately, I think it comes down to this. I don't know that originality or uniqueness or being non-generic or non-cookie cutter is something that should generally be focused on. I think if you look at a lot of the novels that you have experience with and you see places where there could be improvement, things that could be done differently, and you're pursuing that differentness for the sake of improving it, not just being unique, then I think there is some value to doing something that is non-generic. But I think chasing uniqueness, originality just for the sake of originality, or lamenting the fact that too many novels are generic, I don't think that alone is a pursuit that has any merit to it. But I am happy to be proven wrong, so let me know in the comments down below what you think of this. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. The cat is biting my foot.